Hey guys, tonight we are going back, way back, to the mud, the cold, the campfire smoke, and the bone-deep exhaustion of a medieval battlefield on the night before everything goes terribly, magnificently wrong. You are not a tourist here. You are not watching from a safe distance with a nice cup of tea and a warm blanket. Tonight you are a soldier, a real one, and the year might be somewhere around 1346 or 1415, or really any of the long parade of brutal centuries that medieval Europe cheerfully dedicated to hitting other people with sharp metal objects. The specific year almost doesn't matter, because the experience of bedding down in a military camp on the eve of a major battle was, across most of that era, remarkably consistent in its misery. You are cold. You are tired. Your feet hurt in ways that modern podiatry has not yet developed adequate language for. And somewhere out there, just beyond the tree line or over that low ridge, there is another army that very much wants to end your personal story before morning. Sleep under these conditions is not a luxury. It is a survival tool, and you are absolutely terrible at accessing it right now. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment telling me where in the world you are listening from tonight and what the local time is. There is something genuinely lovely about knowing that someone in Tokyo and someone in Toronto and someone in a small town in Portugal are all drifting off together to the sound of medieval soldiers complaining about their sleeping arrangements. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You probably won't survive this, by the way, statistically speaking, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. It is late afternoon shading into evening, and the army you belong to has been marching since before the sun was fully up. The column stretched for miles behind you, a long, clanking, cursing, sweating serpent of men, horses, supply wagons, camp followers, livestock, siege equipment, and the kind of accumulated human smell that you genuinely cannot prepare yourself for until you are standing inside it. Medieval armies were not small, clean, or quiet. A major engagement might involve tens of thousands of men, and all of those men needed to stop somewhere for the night. All of them needed, in theory, to rest. All of them needed to eat, to tend their equipment, to water their animals, to find somewhere flat enough to lie down without rolling into a ditch. The commanders have chosen this ground, and as choices go, it is not inspiring. You are on the edge of a field that was, until recently, someone's farmland. The stubble of old crops still pokes up through the mud in places. There is a stream nearby, which sounds pleasant right up until you realize that several thousand men and their horses are all going to be using it simultaneously for drinking, washing, watering animals, and purposes best left unspecified. Medieval armies were, to put it gently, not rigorous about separating their water sources from their waste disposal. This will become relevant later in our journey, when we talk about the various exciting biological processes happening in this camp that have absolutely nothing to do with combat. For now, though, you are focused on the immediate problem, which is that the sun is going down and you have no idea where you are sleeping tonight. The camp is forming around you with a kind of chaotic energy that somehow, eventually, resolves itself into something almost organized. This is one of the genuinely impressive things about medieval armies that historians tend to underline. They were, despite appearances, not simply mobs. They had structures. They had hierarchies. They had, in many cases, sophisticated logistical systems for deploying thousands of people across a landscape and keeping them more or less pointed in the right direction. The Romans had pioneered the concept of the marching camp, a standardized, fortified overnight position that could be constructed with military efficiency, and while medieval European armies did not always follow Roman standards with any great discipline, the basic principle of organized encampment had filtered through the centuries in various forms. What you see around you is the medieval version of that principle, which is to say, broadly intentional but wildly imperfect. The great lords and their retinues are staking out the best ground near the center or the higher elevation. Tents, real tents, proper pavilions with poles and guy ropes, and even, in some cases, wooden floors, are going up in that section of the camp with practiced efficiency, because great lords travel with servants whose entire job is erecting those tents. The canvas billows and snaps in the evening breeze, and from where you are standing, it looks almost comfortable. It looks almost like somewhere a human being might actually sleep. You are not sleeping there. You are somewhere in the great middle mass of the army, A foot soldier, perhaps, or a lesser man-at-arms, or one of the many thousands of archers, spearmen, and assorted fighters who make up the bulk of any medieval force. Your sleeping situation will be determined not by where you would like to sleep, but by where there is space and what you can cobble together from the materials available to you, and how quickly you can claim it before someone else does. Medieval camp life operated on a fairly aggressive version of first come first served, moderated by rank, physical size, and the willingness to argue. The light is failing faster than you would like. In the months around a summer campaign, you might have until 8 or 9 in the evening before full dark descends, but in the shoulder seasons, and medieval campaigns often pushed into autumn, when the harvest was in and lords had fewer agricultural excuses not to fight, darkness comes early and hard. There are fires beginning to flicker across the camp now, small ones at first, then larger communal fires as groups of men pool their resources and their wood. Firewood is already becoming an argument. It always becomes an argument. The men who arrived first grabbed what they could from the surrounding area. Broken fence posts, branches from the copse of trees on the field's edge, in some cases actual structural timber from the farmhouse that used to stand near here and no longer does, for reasons the farmer will find deeply upsetting when he returns. You find your section, the loose grouping of men you have been marching with, your unit in the informal sense, the people you recognize by face and smell if not always by name. There is a kind of comfort in this, even here, even now. Humans are relentlessly social animals, and medieval soldiers were no different. The group clusters together not just for warmth and practical reasons, though those matter enormously, but for the older, deeper reason that proximity to other human beings is itself a form of comfort when the darkness is full of unknown things and tomorrow holds what tomorrow holds. Someone has a fire going. Someone else has produced, from somewhere in the depths of their pack or their cart, a small pot. The evening meal, such as it is, and we will talk about this in considerably more detail later, is beginning to happen. There is the smell of wood smoke, and something boiling, and the animal warmth of bodies pressed close together against the cooling air. Historians still argue whether medieval armies maintained anything like a consistent encampment discipline, whether the lines between units were respected, whether latrines were actually dug at a sanitary distance, whether the theoretical organization of a medieval camp ever matched its chaotic reality on the ground. The evidence suggests the answer is, sometimes in some armies under some commanders. The English army at Agincourt in 1415 was reportedly kept under unusually strict discipline by Henry V, who forbade unnecessary noise and movement in the hours before the battle. Other armies, the great Chevauchee forces that burned their way across France, for instance, operated with considerably more creative freedom, which is a polite way of saying that the camp looked like a city after a very enthusiastic festival. What is consistent across almost all of the accounts we have, chronicles, memoirs, supply records, the occasional letter home, is the sheer density of people. You are not sleeping in solitude tonight. You are sleeping in a crowd. The man whose elbow is currently in your ribs is not going anywhere. The 3 men behind you, arranged like badly stacked firewood, are your neighbors for the night whether you like it or not. Personal space, in the modern sense, is a concept so alien to this environment that it would require lengthy explanation to even introduce. This density was, in a way, its own kind of protection. Bodies generate heat. Packed together, men who might have shivered dangerously through a cold night stayed marginally warmer. This was understood instinctively, even if no one was articulating it in those terms. You lean into it, literally. You pull your cloak tighter, you let the shoulder of the man next to you press against yours, and you watch the fire burn down through its first eager blaze into the steadier, more serious business of keeping the dark at bay. Around you, the camp settles into its evening rhythms. Arguments flare and subside. Prayers are said, quietly or loudly depending on temperament, and medieval soldiers were, with notable exceptions, genuinely pious people for whom the eve of battle had profound spiritual weight. Equipment is checked and rechecked because checking your equipment is something to do when your hands need to be busy and your mind doesn't want to be idle. Dice appear. Songs start and stop. Somewhere, not far enough away, someone is being very aggressively sick. The stars are coming out above the camp now, brilliant and cold and completely indifferent to what is happening below them. You have seen these same stars your entire life, from your village or your lord's estate or whatever corner of this complicated world you were born into, and they look exactly the same here. This is, you find, both comforting and faintly absurd. The universe is not reconfiguring itself for your drama. The stars do not care about the battle tomorrow. They will be there afterward, unchanged, whether you are or not. The quirky historical footnote that tends to get lost in the grand narrative of medieval warfare is just how much of a soldier's mental energy on campaign was consumed not by fighting, but by the endless, grinding logistics of keeping himself alive and functional between fights. Sleep was part of that logistics. It was not a passive thing that happened to you. It was something you had to actively engineer night after night in conditions that were actively hostile to it. The medieval soldier who survived a long campaign had, among his other skills, developed an almost professional ability to sleep anywhere, in any conditions, in any amount of noise, under any level of physical discomfort. You are not there yet. You are, tonight, still at the beginning of that education. The fire is lower now. The talking around you has softened from the full-throated noise of early evening into something quieter, more fragmented. A murmur here, a grunt there, the occasional burst of low laughter that fades quickly. Men are arranging themselves for sleep with the resigned creativity of people who have been doing this for weeks. Cloaks pulled tight, packs used as pillows, knees drawn up, bodies turned to maximize warmth and minimize the angle of the wind. You do the same. You do what you can. You close your eyes to the firelight and the cold and the smell and the noise, and you genuinely try, to let the exhaustion of the day pull you under into something that might generously be called rest. It does not come easily, but then it never does. And in the morning, there is a battle waiting for you. But that is morning. For now, just for now. Let's stay here in the half-dark, in the crowd, in the smoke and the cold and the strange suspended moment before everything begins. The ground beneath you is making its intentions very clear, and its intentions are not friendly. There is a root, or possibly a rock, or possibly some unholy hybrid of the two, pressing directly into the small of your back with a focused, personal malice that suggests the earth itself has decided to take sides in tomorrow's conflict, and has chosen against you. You shift. You adjust. You perform the ancient, universal, deeply undignified shuffle of a person trying to find a comfortable position on hard ground, the same shuffle that your distant ancestors performed in their caves and that campers perform in their tents to this day, because some problems are eternal. The question of what medieval soldiers actually slept on, what they put between themselves and the ground, if anything, is one of those details that the grand sweep of military history tends to skip over in favor of more dramatic material. Chronicles love a good cavalry charge. They are considerably less interested in where the cavalry slept the night before. But the material reality of a soldier's bedding is not a trivial matter. Sleep quality affects combat performance. Physical rest, or the lack of it, determines whether a man can swing a weapon effectively at 7 in the morning after a night spent on frozen earth. The medieval military establishment understood this in a practical way, even without the modern science to articulate it precisely. So let's talk about what you actually have to sleep on tonight, because the answer is more complicated and more ingenious in its way than you might expect. If you are a common foot soldier, a spearman or archer drawn from the peasantry or the urban poor, your bedding situation is essentially this: whatever you carried, whatever you can find, and whatever you can negotiate or steal from the immediate environment. This sounds desperate, and sometimes it was. But medieval people were, by modern standards, extraordinarily accustomed to sleeping without the infrastructure we consider baseline. Most common people in medieval Europe did not have the kind of beds we imagine. The grand carved furniture of wealthy households was not the norm for the majority of the population. Many ordinary people slept on straw-filled pallets or simple mats, or in some regions just on the floor near the fire with a cloak or blanket pulled over them. The transition from sleeping on a rough floor at home to sleeping on the ground on campaign was not, for many soldiers, as dramatic as it would be for a modern person. What a soldier carried for sleeping was typically a cloak, the single most important piece of kit for a medieval foot soldier, and one that served approximately 15 different functions simultaneously. The cloak was your rain gear, your blanket, your pillow, your ground sheet in a pinch, your emergency bandage, your privacy screen, and your primary defense against the fundamental medieval outdoor experience of being cold and wet. A good wool cloak was nearly waterproof when the lanolin was still in the fiber, and wool has the useful property of retaining some insulating capacity even when damp, which it was going to be because everything was always damp on campaign. You wrap it around yourself now with the practiced efficiency of someone who has done this every night for weeks, and you feel fractionally better. Beyond the cloak, a soldier might carry a blanket, coarser and heavier than a modern equivalent, woven from wool, possibly smelling richly of all the previous nights it has survived. Wealthier soldiers might have a bedroll of some kind, a simple construction of layered fabric that could be tied to a pack or slung over a horse. Men-at-arms, the middling military class above the common foot soldier but below the knightly elite, often traveled with a small cart or a pack animal that could carry additional gear, including more substantial sleeping equipment. A dedicated sleeping bag in the modern sense did not exist, but the principle of layering insulating material around the body was perfectly well understood and widely practiced. The ground itself, though, remains the fundamental problem. And this is where medieval soldiers demonstrated a genuinely impressive range of creative solutions. Straw was the gold standard when you could get it. A layer of straw between a human body and the ground does remarkable things. It provides insulation from the cold earth. It cushions pressure points. It keeps moisture from wicking directly into your clothing and blankets. Medieval armies campaigning through agricultural regions would strip the countryside of straw with the focused efficiency of a locust swarm, not just for the horses, which needed it desperately, but for the men. The logistics of acquiring straw for a large army's overnight stop was a real concern for quartermaster-type figures, and contemporary accounts of major campaigns sometimes note it specifically. The army paused here, the army sent foraging parties there. The army appropriated the contents of that particular barn. If you have straw tonight, you are doing relatively well. You arrange it under your cloak with careful attention, filling in the low spots, trying to create something approaching a flat, yielding surface. If there is no straw, and there often was no straw, particularly if you were deep in hostile or already stripped territory, you improvise. Bracken ferns, when you can find them, work reasonably well and have the advantage of being springy and naturally somewhat water-repellent. Dry leaves, where available, can be piled into a reasonable sleeping mat, though they compress quickly and tend to scatter the moment you move. Pine branches, stripped of their needles and laid flat, create a surprisingly effective bedding layer and have been used by soldiers and woodsmen across cultures for centuries. You use what the landscape offers. You become, of necessity, an expert in the sleeping properties of various ground covers. There is a quirky footnote in the historical record worth mentioning here. Some medieval soldiers, particularly those on longer campaigns, carried small sewn sacks specifically intended to be stuffed with whatever local material was available. Proto-sleeping bags, in a sense, or field-expedient mattresses. These were not standard issue in any formal military system, but personal innovations developed by practical people solving a practical problem. A soldier who had been on several campaigns had usually figured out at least one or two personal tricks for making the night marginally more survivable, and this was one of them. The tent question is worth addressing directly, because popular imagination tends to picture medieval armies as either sleeping entirely in the open or in romantic pavilion tents. The reality, as usual, is more complicated and more interesting. Tents did exist in medieval armies, but they were not democratically distributed. They were expensive, real canvas tents required skilled manufacture, significant material and maintenance, and in an era where armies were largely self-equipped, the quality of a soldier's overnight shelter corresponded almost exactly to his economic status. Great lords had great tents. Knights might share a tent between 2 or 3. Lesser men-at-arms might have a simple lean-to arrangement. Common soldiers largely slept in the open or constructed rough shelters from whatever was at hand. The construction of field shelters, improvised structures assembled from branches, cloaks, tent pegs, rope, and ingenuity, was a skill that experienced soldiers developed quickly, because the alternative was sleeping fully exposed to weather that did not respect military schedules. A simple lean-to against a fence or a wall could deflect rain and wind significantly. A circle of men with their cloaks arranged to create a windbreak was warmer than individuals sleeping separately. 2 spears driven into the ground with a cloak stretched between them and weighted at the edges with rocks created something approaching a low tent, adequate for keeping off a light rain and holding in body heat. Historians still argue whether there was any formal instruction in these fieldcraft techniques within medieval armies, or whether they were purely passed on informally through the culture of campaigning, learned by watching experienced soldiers and copying what worked. What you are building right now, in the failing light, with the help of two men you have been marching alongside for the past 3 weeks, is something in this improvised tradition. There is a wagon nearby. Supply wagons are excellent windbreaks, being large, solid, and conveniently present, and you have positioned yourselves against its lee side, using it to block the prevailing wind. A cloak has been strung at an angle from the wagon side rail to a pair of stakes driven into the ground, creating a sloped roof of sorts that will at least partially deflect rain if it comes. Straw from the wagon, which nominally belongs to someone else, but that someone else is asleep and you are not, has been spread beneath this arrangement. It is not comfortable by any reasonable modern standard. It is, by medieval campaign standards, actually fairly decent. The men settling in around you are going through their own variations of this process. Every group has developed its own micro-strategies. Some men prefer to sleep sitting up against something solid, back to the wagon wheel or the tree trunk, chin on chest, because lying flat means you wake with mud in your hair and your cloak soaked from below. Some sleep in shifts, one man staying more wakeful while others rest, though this is more common in actual sentry rotations than in the main body of the camp. Some men arrange themselves in a circle with their feet pointing inward toward the small fire, radiating outward like the spokes of a wheel, because this maximizes the number of people who can benefit from a single heat source. The fire is important. We should talk about the fire, because the relationship between medieval soldiers and their campfires was intimate and complex in a way that goes beyond simple warmth. Fire was light, yes, and heat, yes, but it was also psychological ballast. A fire at your back meant something at your back. It meant the dark was not quite so total, the cold not quite so absolute, the loneliness of being a small human in a large hostile world not quite so pressing. Medieval people had a relationship with darkness that modern people, surrounded by electric light, can barely imagine. Total darkness was a real and regular feature of night, and it was understood to be a space where bad things happened, not just abstractly but practically and spiritually. The fire pushed the dark back. That mattered. It also, of course, made your position visible to anyone who might be looking. This was a real tactical consideration, and commanders sometimes issued orders about campfire discipline, limiting fires or limiting their size, or organizing them in ways that minimized the camp silhouette. Whether these orders were obeyed consistently is another question entirely, because the tension between tactical prudence and the human need for warmth and light was real and ongoing. You tend the fire for a while, adding a stick, adjusting the arrangement, the kind of idle campfire management that occupies the hands while the mind does its own slow work. The straw beneath you is warm now from your body heat, and it smells of horse and field and autumn, and the wagon above you creaks slightly in the wind, and somewhere nearby someone has started snoring with the committed energy of a man who has completely surrendered to unconsciousness and is not coming back. You are jealous of him. Your back still hurts, despite the straw. The root, definitely a root you have now determined, after extensive investigation, has merely relocated its grievance from your lower back to the point of your hip. Your cloak is warm enough on top, but your boots are still on because taking them off in a military camp means waking up to find them gone, and your feet are therefore trapped in a moist, persistent warmth that is not comfortable exactly but is better than the alternative. There is a moment in the process of settling for sleep in a place like this when you stop fighting it. When the accumulated exhaustion of the day, the miles, the weight, the alertness required to keep moving through complicated terrain as part of a large, fractious group, finally becomes too heavy to push against any longer. It is not quite the same as the comfortable drowsiness of a warm bed. It is something more utilitarian, more fundamental. Your body simply declares that it is done, and your mind, after arguing briefly, agrees. You are not comfortable. You will not be comfortable. Comfort is not tonight's category. Tonight's category is rest, the bare minimum of biological recovery that allows a human body to function tomorrow, and on that very modest metric, the straw and the wagon and the shared warmth of the men beside you may actually be sufficient. The fire is just a glow now. The camp around you has not gone quiet. It has merely changed its register, the full-voiced noise of evening settling into the lower, stranger soundscape of a large group of people attempting sleep. We will spend more time in that soundscape very shortly because it is, frankly, extraordinary. But for now, you are horizontal. For now, the ground holds you. For now, the straw is between you and the cold earth, and the cloak is around you, and the wagon is at your back, and the stars are above you in their cold, indifferent magnificence. It is not nothing. It is not a bed, but it is not nothing. It starts with the horses. It always starts with the horses because horses are large animals with strong opinions about their circumstances, and their circumstances tonight are not ideal. They are picketed in lines along the camp's edge, hundreds of them, in a large army, possibly thousands, tied to ropes strung between stakes or posts, standing in the dark with the particular restless energy of animals that can smell something wrong on the wind. Whether they can actually smell the enemy army camped somewhere beyond the ridge, or whether they are simply responding to the general ambient tension of 10,000 humans trying to suppress their anxiety in close proximity, is a question that nobody has definitively answered. What is not in question is the noise they make about it. Horses do not suffer in silence. They stamp, they shift, they blow through their nostrils with that deep, resonant snort that carries remarkably far on still night air. They occasionally whinny, a sound that seems designed by nature to travel as far as possible and wake as many people as possible. And when one horse whinnies, the horses near it tend to respond, and the horses near those respond, and within 30 seconds you have a rolling wave of equine complaint working its way down the picket line like a very loud, very slow domino effect. You are awake again. You were almost asleep, genuinely almost there, hovering in that warm, shallow water just above full unconsciousness, and the horses have pulled you back to the surface. You lie still, eyes open, staring at the underside of your improvised cloak roof, and you listen to the night. And the night, it turns out, has a great deal to say. The soundscape of a medieval military camp at night is one of those sensory experiences that no document quite captures fully, but that various chronicles, memoirs, and literary accounts gesture at in ways that let you reconstruct it with reasonable confidence. It is not one sound. It is not even a collection of sounds. It is a texture, a continuous, layered, dynamic acoustic environment that has no off switch and no quiet hour. Modern people who have never slept in genuinely crowded outdoor conditions consistently underestimate how noisy a large group of human beings is, even when they are all theoretically trying to sleep. Start with the snoring because the snoring is foundational. Thousands of men, exhausted from marching, many of them sleeping in positions that are not great for airway maintenance. On their backs on the ground with their heads at odd angles, or propped against surfaces in ways that crimp the neck, produce a collective snoring output that is, by any objective measure, impressive. It is not a uniform sound. It is a symphony of snoring, a rich orchestral work featuring bass rumbles, mid-range rattles, high-pitched whistles, sudden explosive snorts, and the occasional dramatic crescendo followed by a brief, unsettling silence and then resumption. Sleep apnea, which modern medicine has identified and named, was absolutely present in medieval populations. The condition does not require the 20th century to exist, and the man 2 feet to your left is providing a masterclass demonstration of it right now. Beyond the snoring, there are the talkers. Humans talk in their sleep. Full sentences, fragments, urgent murmurs, occasional shouts, and in a camp of thousands, there are always some of them audible at any given moment. Sleep talking is, in most cases, harmless and even vaguely entertaining when it is not your own rest being disrupted. The man across the fire from you has been conducting what sounds like a detailed negotiation in his sleep for the past several minutes. Pausing, responding to unheard counterpoints, apparently reaching an agreement, then looking troubled about it. You have no idea what the dream transaction involves. You are, despite yourself, slightly curious. Then there are the coughers. Campaign coughing is its own category, and we will address the full horror of campaign illness in a later chapter, but the nighttime acoustics of a camp contain a persistent underscore of coughing that never quite stops. Men with chest infections acquired from weeks of sleeping in damp conditions. Men with the kind of persistent cough that comes from breathing smoke every evening around poorly drafted fires. Men who have been wading through rivers and sleeping in wet clothing and eating inadequate food for weeks and whose immune systems are doing what they can with inadequate materials. The coughing ripples through the camp in waves, one man triggering another, the sound carrying on the still air in a way that feels somehow more intimate and more melancholy than the snoring. Historians still argue whether the respiratory disease load in medieval armies was primarily a function of the cold and wet conditions, or whether the extreme density of encampment, thousands of people breathing each other's air in close proximity, was the more significant factor in how quickly illness spread through a campaign force. The answer is almost certainly both, interacting in ways that medieval medicine had no framework to understand and limited tools to address. Beyond the human sounds, there are the sounds of the camp's infrastructure. Wagons creak as the wood expands and contracts with temperature changes. Tent ropes hum in the wind, and tent fabric snaps and billows when gusts arrive. The picket ropes holding the horses rasp against their stakes. Cooking equipment, pots, ladles, the metal hardware of field kitchens shifts and clinks. Somewhere, someone's poorly secured equipment has come loose and is making a rhythmic banging sound against something else. The medieval equivalent of a car alarm, which nobody is getting up to fix because getting up means leaving your warm spot. The sentries add their layer. Medieval armies maintained night watches, rotating guards positioned at the camp's perimeter and at key points within it. And part of a sentry's function was to call out at regular intervals, partly to communicate their presence to officers making inspection rounds, partly to reassure the camp that the watch was being kept. This call and response of sentries, voices carrying through the dark from different points around the perimeter, is one of the more distinctive sounds of a medieval camp night. It is, in its way, almost comforting proof that someone is awake and watching, that the darkness is being monitored. The calls are brief, formulaic, and repeat on a rhythm that your sleeping brain eventually incorporates into its background processing. There is a quirky historical footnote here that genuinely delights the researchers who find it. Some medieval commanders issued specific instructions about the sentry call and response system, including codes and countercodes that changed nightly, to prevent enemy infiltrators from impersonating sentries. The idea of an enemy agent wandering into your camp, trying to fake a sentry call in the right language with the right accent and the right code word, is both genuinely threatening and faintly comedic, the medieval equivalent of a password prompt, conducted in the dark across a muddy field, by men who had been awake for 20 hours. You listen to the sentries for a while. Their calls are distant enough to be unthreatening but close enough to be real. You find the rhythm of them, the pause, the call, the answer from further along the line, and it becomes, unexpectedly, something to anchor yourself to. A pulse in the darkness. Evidence of organization in the chaos. Evidence that the night, despite everything, is being managed. The wind picks up briefly, sending a cold finger under your cloak roof and reminding you of the temperature in a pointed way. Medieval campaigns in the temperate European climate ran into weather that ranged from the merely unpleasant to the genuinely dangerous. Hypothermia, though not named or understood as a clinical entity, killed soldiers on campaign. Men who were already depleted, underfed, wet, and exhausted could slip into dangerous cold fairly quickly on a bitter night. And the sleep of hypothermia's early stages is insidious because it is not unpleasant. You feel, in a sense, pleasantly drowsy. This is the danger. You are not hypothermic tonight. It is cold but not that cold, and the combination of your cloak, the straw, the wagon wall, and the bodies of the men around you is keeping you in a survivable temperature range. But you are aware of the cold as a presence, a character in this night with its own agenda. You pull the cloak tighter and tuck your hands under your arms and bend your knees slightly to reduce surface area, all the small adjustments that the body makes automatically in cold conditions, a program written so deep in your biology that it runs without conscious instruction. The noise level shifts as the night deepens. There is a rhythm to it, even here. The first hour or two after most of the camp has lain down are the loudest. The transitional period when bodies are still adjusting, when the conversations of the evening have not quite finished, when the horses are at their most restless. Then there is a period, roughly in the middle of the night, when things get quieter. Not quiet, quiet is not on the menu, but quieter. The deep phase of the camp's collective sleep, when even the most dedicated snorer settles into a steadier rhythm and the random disturbances become less frequent. This is when, if you are lucky, you can snatch the longest unbroken run of actual sleep you will manage tonight. It might be 2 hours. On a good night, 3. Then the early hours bring their own disturbances. Animals are more active before dawn. The foxes and deer and other creatures that share this landscape have been doing their business all night while the humans occupied their attention, and their sounds infiltrate the camp from outside the perimeter. Men who went to sleep with full bladders wake up to deal with the consequences, and the process of thousands of men taking care of biological necessities in a crowded camp is, acoustically and otherwise, a significant event. The sentries change rotation with a certain amount of shuffling and low-voiced argument. Horses, sensing the approaching dawn before humans do, begin their morning commentary. And beneath all of this, beneath the snoring and the coughing and the horses and the sentries and the wind and the creaking wagons, there is something else. A sound that is not quite a sound, or rather, a quality of sound that is specific to a camp on the night before a major battle. It is the sound of thousands of people not sleeping as well as they pretend to be, of men lying still with their eyes open, or eyes closed but minds running, or dozing in shallow cycles that never quite go deep. Of the whole enormous organism of the army processing what tomorrow means in the only time available for private thought, the dark, the cold, the unwitnessed middle of the night. You can hear it or think you can, the particular quality of wakefulness that passes itself off as sleep. It is not something you can point to specifically, no individual sound gives it away. It is the texture of the silence between the other sounds, the weight of collective unrest that hangs over the camp like its own kind of weather. A mainstream historical fact worth landing here, the English longbowmen at Agincourt, cold, outnumbered, and acutely aware of both facts, spent their night before the battle doing what practical men do in impossible situations, which was maintaining their equipment and sleeping where and when they could. Contemporary accounts describe the English camp as notably quieter than the French, partly by royal command and partly perhaps because the English soldiers, facing what must have seemed like genuinely terrible odds, had moved through fear and out the other side into the strange calm that sometimes follows the acceptance of a situation you cannot change. Whether that calm produced actual sleep or merely its convincing impression is something the chronicles don't quite resolve. Somewhere in the camp, there is singing. It is distant enough to be more atmospheric than disruptive. A group of men, probably around a fire that has been kept going later than it should, singing something slow and in parts, a kind of harmony that rises and falls with the wind. Medieval soldiers sang. This is well documented and worth remembering, because it cuts against the purely grim picture that is easy to construct from the hardships. They sang working songs, drinking songs, religious songs, songs from home that probably meant something different out here in the dark of a campaign camp than they did in the tavern or the church where they were learned. Music was social glue, emotional release, a way of asserting human presence against the inhuman scale of what was happening around them. The singing fades. The night deepens. The horses have settled into a more resigned version of their earlier restlessness. The snoring continues its democratic concert. The sentries call and answer in the dark. You are not asleep, but you are not quite awake either. You are in that middle country, the liminal zone between consciousness and unconsciousness, that the medieval mind had its own name and framework for, which we will explore in considerable detail when we reach the section on dreams and the supernatural. For now, it is simply the place you inhabit, suspended between the day that is over and the day that has not yet started, listening to a sound that no recording exists of, that no one alive has heard, that is gone as completely as the men who made it. Except that you are hearing it, right now, in the dark and the cold, with straw beneath you and the wagon at your back and 10,000 strangers breathing in the night around you. Lie still. Stay in it for a moment. Your stomach is making its own contribution to the night's soundscape, and it is not a polite one. It has been approximately 4 hours since you ate, which in the context of a hard marching day means that your body has long since burned through whatever fuel it was given and is now filing formal complaints through the only channels available to it. The complaints are audible. The man next to you shifts slightly, and you cannot tell whether he is adjusting for comfort or registering a diplomatic protest about the noise your digestive system is generating. Let's talk about what you ate tonight because it is important, and because the story of medieval military food is one of those histories that swings between the genuinely fascinating and the genuinely appalling with very little warning. The evening meal on campaign, when there was one, which was not always guaranteed, happened sometime in the late afternoon or early evening, whenever the march ended and the fires got going and the supply wagons could be accessed. It was not a leisurely affair. There was no table service. There was no menu. There was, in most cases, a central distribution of raw or semi-processed ingredients to groups of men who were then responsible for turning those ingredients into something edible using whatever equipment they had carried and whatever fire they could build. The medieval army's approach to feeding itself was decentralized in a way that would give a modern logistics officer a significant headache. Not one mess hall serving thousands, but thousands of small fires each producing something marginally different from the same basic materials. Those basic materials were, for common soldiers, fairly consistent across most of medieval European warfare. Bread was the foundation, hard, dense, often stale by the time it reached you, made from whatever grain was available, which was usually not the finest. The bread of a military campaign was not the bread of a prosperous household. It was campaign bread, designed for durability over palatability, sometimes twice baked to extend its shelf life in the manner of hardtack, sometimes simply the regular bread of the region that had been bought, requisitioned, or taken from local populations and had spent several days in a supply wagon, acquiring the particular character that several days in a supply wagon imparts to bread. You had bread tonight. You are relatively certain about this. It was dense and slightly sour and required more chewing than seemed reasonable for something nominally classified as food, but it was bread, it was calories, and you ate it without complaint because complaint was not going to improve it. Beyond bread, the common soldier's evening meal might include pottage, a word that covers an enormous range of preparations, from the genuinely nutritious to the genuinely mysterious, but which essentially means a thick stew or porridge made by boiling things together until they coalesce into something spoonable. The things boiled together could be grain, oats, barley, whatever was available, with whatever vegetables the foraging parties had managed to acquire or requisition from the local countryside. Peas and beans were campaign staples, being both nutritionally useful and capable of surviving transport in dried form. Onions appeared with some regularity. Root vegetables when the season and the territory provided them. Occasionally, herbs, not for gourmet reasons but because some of the men knew which plants growing along the road had useful properties, and added them more or less automatically. Meat was more complicated. Fresh meat was available when animals were slaughtered, either from the army's own livestock, which traveled with the column for exactly this purpose, or from animals taken in foraging, but fresh meat spoils quickly, and distributing it evenly across a large army before it went bad was a logistical challenge. Salt meat was more practical for campaign. Preserved pork, salt fish, dried or smoked products that could travel without refrigeration. The salt fish in particular was a medieval campaign staple that appears repeatedly in supply records, requisition documents, and the kind of soldier memoirs and chronicles that mention food at all, which is actually more of them than you might expect. Soldiers complained about their food with the same enthusiasm they brought to complaining about everything else, and this gives us a reasonably detailed picture of what they were eating and how they felt about it. How they felt about it was, broadly, not enthusiastic. The quirky historical detail that tends to delight food historians is the degree to which alcohol was considered a nutritional staple rather than a luxury in medieval military provisioning. Ale and beer, weak by modern standards, but caloric and safer than water of uncertain provenance, were part of the official supply calculations for armies in ways that make modern military nutritionists blink. Wine was more prevalent in southern European armies and in the supplies of wealthier forces. The reasoning was partly practical. Fermented beverages kept better than water, and the mild alcohol content did provide some antimicrobial benefit relative to untreated water sources, and partly cultural in that medieval people understood ale and wine as genuinely nutritious substances, which in a caloric sense they were. You had a measure of something this evening, ale, probably, or perhaps a thin wine, depending on whose territory you are in and what the supply situation allows, and it sits in you now with a warmth that is one of the few unambiguously positive sensory experiences of the past several hours. The foraging question deserves some attention, because it was central to how medieval armies fed themselves, and because it generated enormous friction with the civilian populations unfortunate enough to be in the army's path. Foraging, the organized or disorganized collection of food resources from the surrounding countryside, was not optional. It was structural. Even the best provisioned medieval army could not carry everything it needed for a long campaign, and the expectation was that the territory through which the army moved would supplement the supply train. This expectation was experienced by the local population as something ranging from inconvenient to catastrophic, depending on the discipline of the army doing the foraging and the quantity of resources available. A well-disciplined army, operating in friendly territory, might forage in an organized way, sending out parties with instructions to purchase or requisition specific items, to leave receipts or promises of future payment, to take what was needed without taking everything. A less disciplined army, or one operating in hostile territory, might simply take whatever it could find and leave the local farmers to cope with the consequences. The English chevauchés in France, the great mounted raids of the 100 Years' War, operated on a deliberate policy of maximizing economic damage to the French countryside, which meant that foraging in those contexts was essentially indistinguishable from organized destruction. The soldiers ate well on those campaigns, at least for a while. The people whose farms they were eating are a different matter. Tonight's meal benefited from foraging. The pottage had something in it that was definitely vegetable, probably turnip, acquired from a field that the advance parties passed through this afternoon. There was also, passed around the fire with slightly more ceremony than the rest of the food, a small piece of hard cheese, the exact provenance of which nobody was asking about too carefully, because sometimes not knowing is a form of social courtesy. Historians still argue whether the caloric intake of common medieval soldiers on campaign was adequate for the physical demands being made of them, or whether most campaign armies were operating in a state of chronic mild undernutrition that compounded their other vulnerabilities. The calculations are difficult because the supply records that survive are inconsistent, the distribution of food within armies was never perfectly equal, and the supplement provided by foraging varied enormously. What seems reasonably clear is that soldiers at the bottom of the military hierarchy, the common foot soldiers who had the least ability to supplement their rations through personal resources or rank-based privilege, were frequently not getting enough. Not starving in most cases, but not thriving either. Running on the kind of caloric deficit that makes a person tired and irritable and less effective than they would otherwise be, which is a suboptimal state in which to fight a battle. The officers and knights ate better. This is true in all armies across all eras and requires approximately no research to establish, but it is worth being specific about in the medieval context because the gap was significant. Great lords on campaign traveled with their own kitchens, actual professional cooks, proper equipment, supplies of higher quality food maintained separately from the common provision. A nobleman's campaign dinner might include multiple courses, decent wine, fresh meat properly prepared, bread made from better flour. The contrast with what you ate tonight is not subtle. It is the difference between a restaurant meal and whatever you can scrape together from the back of a cabinet after a very long day. This disparity was not invisible to common soldiers, who were not stupid and who could see the better food happening in the Lord's tent section of the camp with perfectly functional eyes. Whether it generated active resentment or was simply accepted as the natural order of things, as one of the many hierarchical facts of medieval life that the common person inhabited without necessarily contesting, is one of those questions about medieval mentality that is genuinely difficult to answer from the inside. Probably both, in different people at different moments, with the balance shifting depending on how bad the common rations were on a given day. There is an interesting recorded incident from a campaign during the 100 Years' War, the specific attribution is debated, in which a group of English soldiers broke into a supply wagon intended for the nobility's use and helped themselves to its contents. The response from the commanders was severe, because maintaining supply discipline was essential, and because the precedent of common soldiers simply taking what they wanted from the supply chain was genuinely destabilizing. But the incident itself tells you something about the pressure that inadequate feeding created in the lower ranks of a campaign army, and about the calculations that hungry, exhausted men make about rules and consequences. Your stomach has quieted slightly, which is either because it has given up on tonight or because the pottage is finally doing something useful. You think about the food with the particular intensity that hungry people bring to thinking about food, cataloging what you ate, assessing whether it was enough, imagining what you would be eating right now in a different life, in a different context. Home food. The specific tastes and smells of wherever you come from, which seem impossibly vivid and impossibly far away in this cold, muddy dark. This is a common experience reported across military memoirs of all eras. The way that the mind on campaign returns obsessively to food from home, elevating ordinary meals into objects of almost painful nostalgia. The medieval soldier did not write memoirs in the modern sense, but the cultural record contains enough, in songs, in the few vernacular accounts that survive, in the complaints logged in letters and chronicles, to suggest that the pattern was consistent. You miss specific tastes. You miss the particular bread of a particular place. You miss the way someone made a particular dish that you would have been entirely indifferent to under ordinary circumstances. Deprivation is an excellent curator of appreciation, if a brutal one. The water situation is worth mentioning before we leave the topic of tonight's provisions, because it is one of those details that medieval military history tends to glide over but which mattered enormously in practice. Clean drinking water was, on campaign, not reliably available. The stream you passed this afternoon is the closest water source, and as we noted earlier, the combination of thousands of men, horses, and the various biological processes of a large encampment had done to it what large encampments reliably do to nearby water. Boiling water before drinking it was understood by some people in some contexts to be beneficial, and campfires made boiling possible, but the germ theory of disease was not available to provide the correct explanation for why this helped, which meant the practice was inconsistent. The ale you drank this evening was, from a public health perspective, actually the correct choice. The brewing process had done things to it that made it safer than the stream water, and medieval people understood this in a practical sense even without understanding the mechanism. Drink the ale over the water where you have a choice. Tonight you had a choice. Tomorrow is less certain. You run your tongue over your teeth, a habit, and taste the residue of the evening. Sour bread and thin pottage and the faint ghost of something smoked from the salt meat that was divided up earlier, and underneath all of it the particular mineral taste of hard water from a region your body is not accustomed to. Campaign taste. The taste of being somewhere that is not home, eating food that is not yours, sitting in a dark that belongs to someone else's landscape. The fire in front of you has burned down to embers now, orange and red in the dark, pulsing faintly when the wind breathes across them. They give just enough light to see the shapes of the men around you. Some asleep, some merely lying still, one man sitting up and staring into the coals with the focused, private expression of a person conducting an internal conversation they have no intention of sharing. You know that expression. You have worn it yourself, in the miles of marching that preceded this night. The face that means, I am doing the calculation. I am running the numbers on tomorrow. I am trying to figure out whether what I have is enough to get through what is coming, and I am not yet sure of the answer. The embers pulse. The camp breathes its complicated breath around you. Your stomach, fed but not satisfied, has made its peace with the situation for now. Tomorrow you will eat again if everything goes well. If everything goes well. The tent is approximately 40 feet from where you are lying, and it might as well be on the moon. It is a proper pavilion tent, canvas dyed in the Lord's colors, which you can't quite make out in the dark, but which you have seen clearly enough during the day's march to know they are vivid and expensive and emphatically not the kind of colors that belong to anyone who sleeps on straw next to a supply wagon. The tent has a pole at its center tall enough to stand upright inside. It has guy ropes staked at precise intervals by servants who knew exactly what they were doing. It has, almost certainly, a wooden floor, portable planking that travels in a dedicated cart specifically for the purpose of giving its occupant a surface that is flat, dry, and not the ground. There is, inside that tent, a camp bed. An actual bed with a frame and a base and a mattress of some kind, probably a canvas sack filled with wool or feathers that deflates somewhat during transport but still constitutes, by any honest reckoning, a mattress. There is a man in that bed right now who is asleep or close to it, and whose experience of this night is so different from yours that it barely qualifies as the same event. Welcome to the medieval military hierarchy of sleep, which is one of the most ruthlessly honest expressions of social stratification you will ever encounter. Rank in a medieval army determined almost everything: your position in the battle line, your share of any plunder, your access to food of quality, your legal status in the event of capture, your likelihood of being ransomed rather than killed. But it also determined, with remarkable precision, the quality of your sleep on the night before the battle. The correlation between social status and sleeping comfort in a medieval military camp was essentially perfect. The higher you were, the better you slept. The lower you were, the worse. And the gap between the top and bottom of that spectrum was not small. Let us walk through the hierarchy, because it is illuminating in ways that go beyond simple fairness. At the very top sits the commander, The king, the great lord, the prince, whoever holds supreme authority over this particular army. His sleeping arrangements on campaign were, by medieval standards, genuinely luxurious, and the machinery required to produce that luxury was substantial. A royal campaign pavilion was not a tent in the way you might casually imagine the word. It was a structure, large enough to contain multiple rooms divided by hanging fabric partitions, a sleeping chamber, an anteroom for advisors and bodyguards, sometimes a separate space for the commander's personal chapel equipment, because great lords traveled with their spiritual infrastructure as well as their military and domestic infrastructure. The sleeping chamber within this arrangement contained a proper bed, the lord's own bed, dismantled at home, transported in pieces, and reassembled here with the focused effort of specialized servants. The mattress came with him. The pillows came with him. The bed hangings, if he was particularly grand, came with him. This was not mere luxury for its own sake, though luxury was certainly part of it. There was a political dimension to the commander's sleeping arrangements that made their quality a matter of practical importance. A medieval lord's tent was a space of governance as well as rest. It was where advisors came for late-night consultations, where decisions were made, where the theater of command was performed. The physical quality of that space communicated something about the lord's power and stability. A commander who slept in squalor suggested an army in trouble. A commander whose pavilion was splendid and well-ordered suggested an army that was managing its affairs. The tent, like the armor and the banner and the war horses, was part of the visual language of medieval military authority. The servants who maintained all of this, and there were many of them because a great lord on campaign traveled with a substantial household staff, slept in whatever space was available around and near the pavilion. They were part of its orbit, available if needed through the night, sleeping in lighter and less comfortable circumstances than their master but considerably better than the common soldiers in the open field. This created a gradient of comfort radiating outward from the commander's tent like heat from a fire, warmest at the center, cooler as you moved away, cold indeed at the edges where you are. Below the great lords in the hierarchy came the knights, and the sleeping situation of medieval knights on campaign is one of the more interesting case studies in the management of status versus practicality. A fully equipped medieval knight, with his armor, his weapons, his destrier and possibly additional horses, his squire, his personal equipment, was a significant logistical enterprise, and the question of where and how he slept was taken seriously by both the knight himself and the army's organizational structure. Knights with significant resources traveled with their own tents, smaller than the great lord's pavilions, but real tents nonetheless, providing genuine shelter and privacy. Inside, a camp bed of some kind was typical, not the elaborate furniture of the great lord, but a functional folding frame with a reasonable sleeping surface. The squire slept nearby, often just outside the tent entrance or in a small adjacent shelter, available and alert. The knight's armor was carefully stored, not worn to sleep in, despite what some romantic notions might suggest, because sleeping in full plate or even mail is not compatible with any kind of meaningful rest and causes the kind of pressure sores and joint problems that a fighting man cannot afford. There is a mainstream historical fact worth landing here that surprises many people. The famous image of the medieval knight sleeping in his armor, ready to leap to battle at a moment's notice, is largely a romantic construction. Real knights removed their armor to sleep whenever circumstances possibly allowed, because the alternative was to arrive at the battle already exhausted from a night of lying in metal. The armor was laid out carefully, the pieces arranged for rapid donning in the morning, with the squire responsible for knowing exactly where every piece was and having it ready at the appropriate time. This was part of the squire's function, not just a valet service, but a genuine military support role that made the knight more effective by handling the logistics that would otherwise consume the knight's own time and energy. The men-at-arms, the fighting men of middling rank who were above common soldiers but lacked knightly status, occupied the middle ground of the sleeping hierarchy in every sense. Some traveled with light tents or substantial lean-to arrangements. Some slept under purpose-built canvas shelters shared between 2 or 3 men of similar status. Some simply had better equipment than the common soldiers, better cloaks, better blankets, bedrolls of genuine quality, and used the same basic approach of sleeping on the ground but did so with materials that made the experience marginally less punishing. The man-at-arms was often a professional fighter, a career soldier, and had developed over years of campaigning the personal kit and the personal strategies that allowed him to function on campaign without destroying himself in the process. Then there are the archers, specifically the English longbowmen who appear so frequently in the campaign records of this period, because they are one of the better documented groups of common soldiers in medieval military history. Longbowmen were not aristocrats. They were drawn from the yeomanry, the free peasantry and the artisan classes, men of limited means but specialized skill. Their sleeping arrangements were essentially the same as those of other common foot soldiers. Open air, whatever they had carried, whatever they could improvise. But they were valued highly enough, and their physical condition mattered enough to their military effectiveness, that there is some evidence of greater attention to their provisioning and basic welfare than was given to simple spearmen. An archer whose draw arm was cramped from a bad night's sleep was an archer who shot less accurately, and accurate archery was the point of the exercise. Historians still argue whether the English system of indentured retinues, the contractual arrangements through which lords raised their military followings, created any meaningful standardization in the sleeping and provisioning arrangements of common soldiers, or whether these remained entirely individual and improvisational regardless of the contractual framework. The contracts themselves specify military service in considerable detail, numbers of men, quality of horses, duration of service, rates of pay, but tend to be silent on the logistics of daily welfare in ways that suggest these were simply assumed to be the soldier's own problem. The camp followers occupy their own complicated position in the sleeping hierarchy, and they deserve acknowledgement because they were present in significant numbers and their situation was in some ways the most precarious of all. Camp followers, the broad category that included merchants, sutlers, craftsmen, laundresses, medical practitioners of varying skill and legitimacy, and the various other civilians who attached themselves to military forces, were not part of the official military structure and had no guaranteed place in the camp's organization. They slept where they could negotiate space, at the camp's edges and in its interstices, in wagons and under wagons, and in whatever improvised structures they could manage. Their proximity to the army offered some protection and significant economic opportunity, but it also placed them in the path of all the army's dangers with none of its formal protections. The laundresses in particular, women who performed the essential service of keeping soldiers' clothing functional and who appear in campaign records with more regularity than the sanitized histories sometimes suggest, had sleeping arrangements that varied enormously based on individual circumstances, personal connections, and the degree of protection offered by whoever in the army they were attached to. Some were essentially part of a lord's household, traveling and sleeping within its orbit. Others were entirely independent operators, making their own arrangements in the chaos of the camp's margins. You are thinking about all of this, or not quite thinking about it, since thinking requires more cognitive energy than you currently have available, but it is moving through your awareness in the slow, disconnected way that things move through a mind that is not quite asleep, because the tent is still visible from where you lie. Just its outline, really, the peaked shape of it against the slightly lighter dark of the sky, the faint warm glow that might be a lamp still burning inside or might be your imagination. Someone in that tent is sleeping in a bed. 40 feet away, someone is sleeping in a bed, with a mattress and blankets and probably a pillow of some kind, sheltered from the wind and the damp, with a servant sleeping nearby who will bring warm water in the morning and help with the armor and ensure that the whole machinery of high-status medieval military life begins its day correctly. You are lying on straw, on the ground, under a cloak strung from a wagon, with a root that has now migrated to the vicinity of your left knee. This is, for the record, not a situation that has produced resentment, or at least not primarily resentment. It has produced something more complex than that. The medieval understanding of social hierarchy was not identical to modern egalitarianism, and the man on the straw did not necessarily look at the man in the tent and feel that an injustice was being done. He might feel envy, certainly. He might feel the particular weariness that comes from knowing your discomfort is structural and permanent. But the sense that things ought to be otherwise, that the distribution of comfort in a military camp was a moral failure of the system, required a framework of equality that medieval culture did not provide in the same form that modern culture does. What the man on the straw felt, most likely, was something more pragmatic and more immediate. He felt cold. He felt the root. He felt the particular solidarity of the men around him, fellow travelers in discomfort, bound by proximity and shared circumstance into a kind of community that had its own value, distinct from and not inferior to the more private comfort of the tent. There was something in the communal huddle around the dying fire, something in the shared misery and the shared dark, that the man in the tent did not have. You pull your cloak tighter. The tent's outline is still there, dark against dark. The Lord inside it, whoever he is, has his bed and his mattress and his lamp and his servant. You have the stars, and the fire's last embers, and the breathing of 10,000 strangers around you. It is not the same thing, but it is not nothing either. There is a specific quality of wakefulness that only exists between midnight and dawn, and you are living in it right now. It is not the alert wakefulness of early evening, when the mind is still processing the day's events and the body is winding down from exertion. It is not the drowsy, negotiable semi-consciousness of the hour just before sleep finally arrives. It is something harder and clearer and less kind than either of those. A cold, bright wakefulness that arrives uninvited somewhere in the deep middle of the night and refuses to leave, and that has the particular quality of making everything feel simultaneously more real and more terrible than it actually is. Modern psychology has a name for this phenomenon and has studied it extensively. Medieval soldiers did not have the name, but they had the experience, and they had it tonight in numbers. You are staring at the inside of your cloak roof. You have been staring at it for some time. You are aware of every physical discomfort in your body with a precision that sleep would mercifully blur. The root at your knee, the cold that has worked its way through the straw and into your hip, the particular ache in your shoulders from carrying a loaded pack for 8 hours, the blister on your left heel that you have been ignoring for 3 days and that has now decided the middle of the night is the correct time to make its formal complaint. You are also aware, with the same unwanted precision, of tomorrow. Tomorrow is the problem. Tomorrow is what is keeping you on the wrong side of sleep. Let us talk about fear in a medieval military camp at night, because it is one of the most human elements of this entire experience, and one of the most consistently underrepresented in the grand narratives of military history. The chronicles love courage. They love the rousing speech before battle, the knight who charged alone against impossible odds, the army that held the line when everything said it should break. They are less interested in the long dark hours before all of that, when ordinary men lay in the cold and the dark and the noise and tried to manage the knowledge of what morning was going to bring. Fear is not the same as cowardice, and medieval soldiers understood this distinction perfectly well. The culture they inhabited had a sophisticated vocabulary for courage. The knight was expected to be brave, yes, but brave in a specific way, a disciplined way, a way that acknowledged fear and acted correctly despite it rather than pretending the fear was not present. The common soldier's version of this expectation was less formally articulated, but no less real. You were expected to show up. You were expected to hold your place in the line. What happened inside you while you did those things was, to some degree, your own private business. The private business of a medieval soldier on the night before battle included fear about a range of things, and it is worth being specific about what those things were, because they were not identical to what a modern person might fear in a similar situation, and the differences are revealing. Death was on the list, obviously, but perhaps not in the position of absolute primacy that we might assume. Medieval people had a different relationship with death than modern people do, not because they valued life less, but because death was more omnipresent in their daily experience. People died of things that modern medicine handles routinely. Children died. Young adults died. The life expectancy numbers that historians debate mask a lived experience in which death was a familiar visitor rather than the shocking anomaly it often seems in contemporary developed world life. A medieval soldier was not encountering the concept of his own possible death for the first time on a battlefield. He had been living alongside it all his life. What he feared, alongside death itself, was the manner of dying. A clean death in battle, a quick end, ideally with some element of honor attached to it, was not the worst outcome. What was worse, in the framework that medieval culture provided, was a bad death. A slow death from a wound that went septic over days. Death by drowning in a river crossing, which was considered particularly undignified. Death while fleeing, which carried social consequences that followed your name and your family after you. And this one is important and often overlooked: death without the proper spiritual preparation. The last rites, the final confession, the prayers that prepared the soul for what came next. Dying without access to these was not just personally frightening in the immediate sense. It had implications that the medieval mind took with absolute seriousness for what happened after. This is why priests traveled with medieval armies. Not just as chaplains in the modern sense, morale officers with religious functions, but as genuinely essential personnel whose role was to ensure that soldiers who were about to risk dying had access to the sacramental preparation that their faith told them they needed. The night before a major battle often saw significant activity around the army's chaplains. Confessions heard in the dark, absolutions given, prayers said, the whole machinery of medieval Catholic spiritual preparation running at capacity. Men who might have been casual about their religious practice in ordinary life became considerably more attentive when the calculus of personal mortality became concrete and immediate. The fear of capture deserves its own discussion, because it operated very differently depending on your rank. For a knight or a man of significant social standing, capture in battle was not necessarily a death sentence. It was the opening of a negotiation. The system of ransom that governed the treatment of captured aristocratic warriors in medieval European warfare was a genuine institution with its own customs, legal frameworks, and economic implications. A captured knight expected to be held in reasonable conditions while his family or lord arranged payment for his release. This was understood by both sides as the correct way to handle the situation, and departures from it, the massacre of prisoners, for instance, were noted as violations of the expected order and generated real scandal. For the common soldier, capture offered no such framework. A captured foot soldier had no ransom value. His fate depended entirely on the practical calculations of his captors, whether keeping him alive was useful, whether killing him was necessary, whether some intermediate option presented itself. The uncertainty was its own form of terror. The knight lying awake in his tent tonight feared capture as a financial and social disruption. You, lying awake on your straw, fear it as a more fundamental threat. The night raid was a specific fear that deserves acknowledgement. The possibility that the enemy, rather than waiting politely for the morning's formal engagement, might send a force through the dark tonight to disrupt the camp. Night raids on enemy encampments were a real tactic in medieval warfare, not commonly employed for major pitched battles but absolutely used in certain contexts, and the possibility of one kept a particular quality of alertness running beneath the surface of even the sleeping camp. The sentries whose calls you have been tracking through the night are partly a response to this possibility. Their voices in the dark are not just ritual, they are a genuine early warning system, however imperfect. Historians still argue whether the psychological management of pre-battle anxiety was deliberately addressed by medieval commanders, or whether it was left entirely to the individual soldier's resources and the informal culture of his unit. There is evidence of both. Some commanders, Henry V at Agincourt is the example most often cited, partly because Shakespeare made it famous and partly because the historical record genuinely supports it, moved through their camps on the night before battle in ways that were clearly intended to manage the psychological state of their men. The visible presence of the commander, his apparent calm, his willingness to share the cold and the dark even briefly with the common soldiers, had real effects on morale that contemporaries noticed and recorded. Other commanders apparently did no such thing, relying on the army's own internal culture to handle the emotional weight of the pre-battle night. Unit cohesion, the bonds between men who had been marching and eating and sleeping alongside each other for weeks, was itself a form of psychological support. You did not need a commander to come and reassure you if the men around you were steady, familiar, and not visibly falling apart. Their calm, such as it was contagious. Their fear was also contagious, which is why the control of panic, the prevention of fear spreading through a unit or a camp and becoming something larger and less manageable, was a genuine leadership concern. Desertion was the practical expression of unmanaged fear, and it was a real and persistent problem for medieval armies on campaign, including on the night before battle. Men left, not in large organized groups usually, but individually and in small groups, slipping away from the camp's edge in the dark, taking their chance with the countryside rather than the morning. The motivations were various: fear of the battle, certainly, but also homesickness, the sense that a particular contract or obligation had been fulfilled or exceeded, simple exhaustion, illness, the accumulating weight of weeks of hard living. Whatever the cause, desertion drained armies of manpower at exactly the moments when manpower was most critical. The sentries at the camp's perimeter served a dual function, watching for enemies coming in, but also watching for soldiers going out. In some armies, the penalty for desertion on the eve of battle was severe and publicly known, intended as a deterrent. Whether deterrence worked consistently is, again, a question the historical record answers with a qualified. Sometimes, fear of punishment competed with fear of battle, and the outcome of that competition varied by individual. You are not going anywhere. This is not a statement about your courage specifically. It is a statement about the web of obligations and relationships and practical realities that hold you in place. You are here because your Lord is here, and your Lord's household is here, and the men you have been marching with are here, and going somewhere else would require a plan and resources and a destination that you do not have. The abstract idea of leaving is available to you in the way that all abstract ideas are available in the middle of the night. Vivid, almost physical, ultimately weightless. You could think about it all night. You will still be here in the morning. The wind has shifted slightly. It is coming now from the direction of the enemy camp, and you cannot quite help trying, to hear something in it. Some sound that carries across the dark fields between the two armies. Some evidence of what is over there, how many of them, how they are spending their own night. The camps are not always close enough for this. Sometimes armies bedded down miles apart and came together only in the morning. Sometimes they were close enough that you could see each other's fires. Tonight, you think you can see fires. Distant, low, possibly imaginary, the kind of thing that might be fires or might be your own eyes generating light in the dark the way eyes do when they have been staring too long. You watch them for a while. They do not resolve into anything clearer. They remain ambiguous, possibly real, possibly not. A question mark on the horizon that you cannot answer from here. There is a prayer happening somewhere nearby. A man's voice, very low, in what might be Latin or might be the vernacular. The distinction between formal liturgical prayer and the more personal, improvised conversation with the divine that medieval people engaged in was not always sharp, and in the middle of the night, on the eve of a battle, the formal distinctions probably matter less than they do in daylight. The voice is steady and quiet and continuous, and it has the quality of something that has been going on for a long time and will continue until it is finished, however long that takes. You find, unexpectedly, that listening to it is calming. Not because of the specific words, which you may not even be catching clearly, but because of the fact of it, the fact that this man, in this dark, in this cold, in this situation, has found a way to do something purposeful with his fear. Has turned it into an act rather than a state. Has given it somewhere to go. You close your eyes. The prayer continues, low and steady. A thread of human sound in the enormous dark. The fires on the horizon, if they are fires, pulse faintly. The sentries call and answer. Tomorrow is still coming. You cannot stop it and you cannot hurry it and you cannot know in advance what it will bring, and this uncertainty, which is the most fundamental form of human suffering, is something you share tonight with every person in this camp. From the Lord in his pavilion bed to the man beside you who has been asleep for 3 hours and is snoring with the peaceful oblivion of someone who has made their peace with the situation or simply run out of energy to resist unconsciousness. You could learn something from that man. You are working on it. Something is moving in the straw. You are not imagining it. You have been still enough and awake enough, and the night has been quiet enough in its current phase that you can hear it quite clearly. A small, purposeful rustling. The sound of something navigating the compressed bedding beneath you with the confident efficiency of a creature that has been doing this for its entire life and considers your presence here a minor inconvenience at most. Pauses. It moves again. It is heading, with apparent intention, toward the area near your feet where you stowed the remnants of tonight's bread in your pack. Welcome to the other population of this camp. The one that doesn't carry weapons, doesn't take orders, doesn't worry about tomorrow's battle, and is, by several measures, doing better than you are. The medieval military camp was not occupied solely by soldiers, servants, and camp followers. It was occupied by everything that humans and their food and their waste and their warmth inevitably attract. Rats and mice, certainly, but also insects of extraordinary variety and commitment, the various parasitic organisms that travel with human bodies as a matter of biological course. and the whole secondary ecosystem of scavengers and opportunists that assembles wherever large numbers of animals and people congregate. The camp you are lying in is, from an ecological perspective, a temporary city, and like all cities, it has its full complement of uninvited residents. The rat, because that is almost certainly what is in your straw, the size and confidence of the movement suggests nothing smaller, is part of a population that has been following this army for weeks. Rats are extraordinary logistical opportunists. They do not need to be invited. They do not need to be accommodated. They simply appear, drawn by the smell of food and the warmth of human habitation, and once they are present they are essentially impossible to dislodge without measures considerably more extreme than a medieval army has available. The supply wagons are particularly attractive to them, a wheeled warehouse of food, traveling obligingly from place to place, accessible through any gap in the wagon's construction, and from the supply wagons they spread through the camp in all directions. The rat in your straw is not, in the immediate sense, dangerous. It is looking for food, not for you. But rats in a medieval military camp represented something considerably more serious than a nighttime disturbance. And this is where we need to spend some time on the topic that military history tends to address in grand epidemiological terms, but that had its most direct impact at exactly this scale. The personal, the immediate, the man lying on straw in the dark with something moving near his feet. Disease killed more medieval soldiers than battle. This is one of those historical facts that gets stated so regularly that it risks becoming a platitude, but it bears genuine examination because the mechanism of it, the way disease moved through a campaign army, was directly connected to the conditions you are lying in right now. The density of the encampment, the compromised water sources, the inadequate food, the accumulated physical depletion of weeks of hard marching, the rats, the insects, the human waste that was never quite far enough from the human food. All of these factors interacted to create an environment in which infectious disease could spread with a speed and thoroughness that the army's medical resources, such as they were, had essentially no capacity to counter. Dysentery was the great constant companion of medieval armies, and its mechanism operated through exactly the water and food contamination that we have already discussed. The symptoms were debilitating enough that men who had survived battles, sieges, and long marches were reduced to complete incapacity by it, unable to fight, barely able to function. Campaign dysentery was not a minor inconvenience. It was a force multiplier for the enemy, reducing effective fighting strength without the enemy having to do anything at all. Armies that entered campaigns at full strength sometimes arrived at their objectives with a third or more of their men incapacitated by illness, a fact that commanders were acutely aware of and could do essentially nothing to prevent given the state of medical knowledge available to them. The lice are not in your straw. They are on you. This is worth stating plainly, because the experience of lice infestation in a medieval military camp was so universal as to be essentially unremarkable, a baseline condition of campaign life rather than a notable affliction. Every soldier on campaign had lice. The knights had lice. The lords had lice, though their better clothing and more frequent access to washing reduced the population somewhat. The common soldier, wearing the same clothing for weeks, sleeping in the same bedding, without access to the washing facilities that might interrupt the lice's reproductive cycle, was simply a habitat. A walking, fighting, sleeping habitat for Pediculus humanus, which has been accompanying Homo sapiens on military campaigns since before the historical record begins and shows no signs of stopping. The quirky historical detail that tends to produce genuine horror in modern audiences is not just that medieval soldiers had lice. It is that they knew they had lice, accepted that they had lice, and dealt with them through a combination of manual removal and resigned tolerance that speaks to a fundamentally different threshold of bodily fastidiousness than the one most contemporary people operate with. The grooming behavior of removing lice from clothing and hair was a social activity in medieval camps. Men delousing each other the way primates groom each other, which is not coincidentally what it is from an evolutionary standpoint. It happened in the daylight hours, casually, as a normal part of camp maintenance. At night, you simply shared your sleeping space with them and accepted the itching as part of the texture of campaign life. You are, in fact, itching. You have been itching in a general, distributed way for several days, and you have stopped registering it as a specific sensation and started experiencing it as a background condition, the way you stop noticing a persistent low noise after sufficient exposure. There is a particular spot behind your left ear that is making a more insistent case for attention, and you scratch it with the automatic efficiency of someone performing a reflex action, and then you stop thinking about it, because thinking about it makes it worse, and there is nothing to be done about it at this hour. The fleas are a separate population with their own schedule and their own agenda, and their agenda unfortunately intersects with yours at regular intervals through the night. Fleas are faster than lice and less constant in their attentions. They arrive, they do what they do, they depart, and the result is the kind of sharp, localized irritation that is specifically designed by evolution to be impossible to ignore. The flea's bite is not its primary danger, though the irritation is real and unpleasant. Its primary danger is as a vector, a mechanism for transferring things between the rats and the humans, a biological bridge between the rodent population in your straw and the human population lying in it. Historians still argue about the precise mechanisms by which the Black Death, the catastrophic plague pandemic that swept through Europe in the mid-14th century, moved so rapidly through populations, and the role of the flea-rat-human transmission pathway is central to that debate. What is not debated is that the conditions of a medieval military camp were, in epidemiological terms, essentially ideal for the amplification and spread of vector-borne disease. The density of both rat and human populations, the constant movement of the army through different territories and therefore different disease pools, the physical depletion of the humans that reduced their immune response, all of these factors combine to make campaign armies both highly susceptible to disease and highly efficient at spreading it. The army you are part of is not, tonight, in the grip of a plague. But it has sick men in it, men who have been ill for days or weeks, who are lying somewhere in this camp running fevers and suffering from various bacterial infections and parasitic infestations that their bodies are attempting to fight with resources already stretched thin by the campaign's demands. Some of them will recover. Some of them will not from tomorrow's battle, but from the illness that has been quietly doing its work in the margins of this campaign while the grand military narrative was busy happening elsewhere. The field surgeons, the medical practitioners who traveled with medieval armies were not nothing. It is tempting to dismiss medieval military medicine as entirely ineffective, but this is an oversimplification that does not survive close examination of the historical record. Medieval surgeons had genuine skills in wound treatment, in the management of fractures, in the removal of projectiles, arrows, crossbow bolts, the various pointed and edged objects that medieval warfare specialized in introducing into human bodies. The surgical knowledge of the medieval period was not modern, but it was not negligible either. Surgeons who traveled on campaign accumulated practical experience that had real value, and some of the wound care techniques documented in medieval medical texts show a pragmatic effectiveness that goes beyond what pure theoretical medicine of the period might have produced. What medieval military medicine could not do was address the infectious disease burden of the camp, because the germ theory of disease did not exist, and without it the correct interventions, clean water, sanitation, pest control, quarantine of infectious individuals could not be systematically applied. Some of these things happened partially and accidentally, through the practical wisdom of experienced campaigners who noticed that certain practices produced better outcomes without understanding exactly why. Boiling water for cooking and drinking, for instance. Keeping latrines at a distance from food preparation areas, when camp discipline was sufficient to enforce it. Moving the camp before disease became too concentrated in a single location, a practice that had logistical motivations but also had the side effect of leaving the disease burden behind in the old site. But the rats kept coming. The lice never left. The fleas moved between their hosts with cheerful indifference to human health. And the water sources remained what they were. The rat in your straw has found something. You hear the particular sound of something being investigated and then consumed, small quick movements of chewing, and you realize with a resigned clarity that it has located the bread you stowed in your pack, which you thought you had fastened securely and apparently had not fastened securely enough. There is a moment in which you consider doing something about this. Getting up, chasing the rat, recovering what remains of the bread. You run this calculation for approximately 4 seconds before concluding that getting up means losing your warm spot, waking the men around you, and expending energy that your body urgently needs to conserve, all in exchange for recovering a piece of campaign bread that was not particularly good when you had it and will be less good after the rat has had its portion. You let the rat have the bread. This is, in its way, a very medieval decision, the pragmatic acceptance of loss when the cost of preventing the loss exceeds the value of what is being lost. Medieval people were, of necessity, extremely practical about resource calculations of this kind. You did not spend more than you had trying to protect less than the effort was worth. The rat gets the bread. You get to stay horizontal. The ledger balances. The smell of the camp at this hour is worth a moment's attention, because it is one of those details that no painting or chronicle quite captures, and that is essential to the full texture of the experience. It is not a single smell. It is a complex, layered olfactory environment that has been building since the army arrived here this afternoon. The baseline of thousands of human bodies in close proximity, overlaid with animal smell from the horse lines, smoke from hundreds of fires in various stages of burning down, the smell of the food that was cooked and the waste products that resulted from eating it, the specific smell of damp wool and damp canvas and damp straw, the sharper notes of metal and leather and the various oils and greases used to maintain equipment. It is, by modern standards, an extraordinary smell. Not entirely unpleasant in all its components, wood smoke is wood smoke, and has been comforting to human nervous systems for the entirety of human history, but extraordinary in its intensity and its complexity. Medieval people who lived and worked on campaigns stopped noticing most of it within days of joining the army, the same olfactory adaptation that lets slaughterhouse workers and fishermen and anyone who works in a strongly smelling environment stop consciously registering what surrounds them. But on the first days of a campaign, or for people encountering a military camp from outside for the first time, the smell was apparently remarkable enough to be worth recording. Several chronicle accounts mention it, in terms ranging from the clinical to the dramatically appalled. You have stopped noticing it, mostly. Occasionally a particularly vivid component breaks through, when the wind shifts and brings the full force of the horse lines, or when someone nearby generates a new contribution to the olfactory landscape, but for the most part it has become part of the background, as unremarkable as the snoring and the cold. The rat has finished with your bread and has departed, its small purposeful rustling fading back into the general texture of the straw. You are still itching behind your left ear. The fleas have made their rounds and temporarily withdrawn. The larger disease process is happening in this camp, the bacteria multiplying in the compromised water supply, the parasites completing their cycles in various hosts. The slow biochemical cascade of the illnesses already established in the sick men lying elsewhere in the camp are entirely invisible to you, operating at a scale and through mechanisms that your world has no framework to perceive. You are, in the most immediate sense, fine. You are cold and itchy and hungry and tired and anxious about tomorrow, but you are not sick tonight, and the things that might make you sick are not things you can see or name or act against. They are simply part of the environment, as fundamental to this experience as the ground and the cold and the noise. In the morning, if everything goes well, you will march away from this camp and leave its accumulated biological legacy behind in the soil. The rats will investigate what remains. The diseases will find new hosts or not, as their own logic determines. For now, you pull your cloak tighter, scratch briefly behind your ear, and return to the business of trying to sleep in a place that is doing its level best to prevent you. The dream, when it finally comes, is about home. This is not unusual. This is, in fact, the most common category of dream reported by soldiers across all eras and all conflicts. The mind, released from the conscious management of immediate danger, travels immediately and instinctively to the familiar, the safe, the specific geography of personal history. You are somewhere you know. There are people you recognize. The light is the particular light of a place you did not know you had memorized until this moment when your sleeping brain reproduces it with a fidelity that waking memory cannot match. You are not cold. You are not lying on straw with a root in your knee. You are somewhere that makes sense in a way that nothing about the past several weeks has made sense. And then something shifts, a sound from outside the dream, or the dream's own internal logic turning in a direction you did not choose, and the familiar place begins to acquire the quality of all meaningful dreams, that simultaneously vivid and unstable quality where you know on some level that you are in a dream but the knowledge does not diminish the experience. It intensifies it. The home becomes more home than home has ever been, saturated with significance. Every detail weighted with meaning that you cannot quite articulate and that will dissolve completely the moment you wake up. This is sleep. This is the part that was actually working. Let us spend some time here, in this territory between waking and the deep dark of full unconsciousness, because the medieval understanding of what was happening to you in this state was profoundly different from the modern scientific account, and no less interesting for that difference. In fact, the medieval framework for understanding sleep, dreams, and the night mind is one of the richest and most complex aspects of medieval intellectual culture, and it had direct, practical consequences for how battles were planned and how armies behaved. The medieval understanding of sleep drew from multiple streams: classical philosophy filtered through centuries of transmission, Christian theology with its own elaborate dream tradition, and the practical folk knowledge of ordinary people who had been observing their own sleep and dreams their entire lives. These streams did not always agree with each other, and the tensions between them produced a genuinely rich and sometimes contradictory body of thought about what sleep was, what dreams meant, and what the appropriate response to a significant dream was. The classical inheritance, mediated primarily through Aristotle and through the medical tradition associated with Galen, understood sleep as a physiological state, a cooling and withdrawal of the vital spirits from the outer body toward its inner core, a necessary recuperative process during which the body replenished what the day's activity had consumed. This framework was sophisticated enough to recognize that sleep was not simply a passive absence of wakefulness but an active biological process with its own stages and characteristics. The dream, in this classical physiological framework, was a product of the sleeping mind processing the day's experiences and the body's physical state, a kind of internal echo of waking perception, generated by the same faculty that produced waking thought but operating without the regulating influence of full consciousness. The Christian theological framework added layers of considerable complexity to this physiological base. Dreams, in the biblical tradition that medieval Christianity inherited and elaborated, were not merely psychological events. They were potential communications from God, from angels, from the saints, or, with equal possibility, from devils and demons who used the unguarded sleeping mind as a point of access that waking reason and faith kept closed. The history of significant dreams in the biblical and early Christian tradition was long and specific: Joseph's dreams in Egypt, the dreams of prophets, the dream of Constantine before the Battle of Milvian Bridge that he interpreted as divine instruction to fight under the sign of the cross. Dreams had changed history. Dreams had delivered prophecy. Dreams had warned the faithful and deceived the unwary. The practical consequence of this framework, for a soldier lying in a medieval camp on the night before a battle, was that the dreams he had tonight were not necessarily just dreams. They were potentially messages. And the content of those messages, their imagery, their emotional register, their apparent subject matter, was worth paying attention to in the morning when the decision of how to fight was still being made. Historians still argue whether the reporting of significant pre-battle dreams by medieval commanders and soldiers was primarily genuine, people actually experiencing vivid dreams and genuinely interpreting them as significant, or whether it was partly a literary and rhetorical convention, a way of framing post hoc explanations for decisions that were made on other grounds. The answer is almost certainly both, in proportions that varied by individual and circumstance. The cultural framework for taking dreams seriously was so pervasive and so deeply embedded in the medieval worldview that it is essentially impossible to disentangle genuine belief from rhetorical deployment. What is clear is that significant pre-battle dreams were taken seriously enough to be reported, recorded, and sometimes acted upon. Chronicles of major medieval battles fairly regularly include accounts of dreams experienced by commanders or significant figures on the night before the engagement. These dreams tend to fall into recognizable categories: visions of saints providing reassurance, apparitions of enemies falling or fleeing, symbolic imagery that could be interpreted as favorable or unfavorable depending on the interpreter. Richard III is famously said to have been troubled by terrible dreams on the night before Bosworth Field in 1485, dreams of demons, in the tradition that a guilty conscience and divine judgment would make themselves known through the night's visions. Whether Richard actually had those dreams, or whether the story was constructed afterward to give supernatural weight to his defeat, is exactly the kind of question that medieval historical scholarship enjoys without resolving. The classification of dreams was a genuine intellectual project in medieval culture. Several frameworks for categorizing dreams circulated, drawing on classical sources and elaborated by medieval thinkers. The most influential of these distinguished between dreams that arose from physical causes, the body state, what you had eaten, your medical condition. Dreams that arose from psychological causes. The day's anxieties, unresolved thoughts, emotional preoccupations, and dreams that came from outside the dreamer, either from divine sources or from demonic ones. The diagnostic challenge was determining which category a given dream belonged to, and the stakes of misclassification were real. Treating a divine message as mere physical noise was a spiritual failure. Treating a demonic deception as a divine message was a spiritual danger. This classification project had direct relevance to the military context. A soldier who dreamed of victory the night before a battle and reported this to his companions or his officer was doing something socially significant. He was offering a piece of evidence in the ongoing collective assessment of tomorrow's prospects. If the dream could be interpreted as divinely sent, it was genuinely encouraging. If it had the marks of physical or psychological origin, if the dreamer had been drinking heavily, or was known to be prone to anxiety, or had eaten something that the medical tradition associated with vivid dreams, its evidential value was correspondingly discounted. The foods associated with producing vivid or disturbing dreams were a matter of genuine medieval medical interest. Cheese, notably, appears repeatedly in medieval medical texts as a dream producer, specifically as a substance that, consumed in the evening, was likely to produce intense and potentially disturbing nocturnal visions. The association between cheese and nightmares is old enough that it filtered into folk knowledge and then into the casual observation of people who had noticed the correlation without understanding the mechanism. Other foods flagged as dream-affecting included certain legumes, heavily spiced dishes, and this one is specific to the medical literature rather than folk knowledge. Various meats whose qualities were thought to produce particular humoral imbalances during digestion that would manifest in dream content. If you ate cheese tonight, which is possible, remember that small piece that appeared at the fire without a clear account of its provenance. You are, by medieval medical theory, at elevated risk of a disturbing dream. This is either reassuring in its specificity or deeply unhelpful in its implications, depending on your mood. The quirky historical detail that genuinely delights the researchers who work in this area is the medieval practice of deliberate dream incubation. The attempt to deliberately produce a prophetically significant dream by performing specific actions before sleep. Sleeping in particular locations associated with saints or sacred significance. Fasting before sleep to clear the body of the physical disturbances that produced mundane dreams. Praying with specific intention before lying down. Asking for divine guidance to manifest in the night's visions. These practices existed on a spectrum from the formally religious, church-sanctioned prayer for divine guidance, to the folk magical, involving charms, objects placed under the pillow, specific words spoken in specific sequences. The boundary between prayer and magic in medieval folk practice was considerably more porous than the official church position suggested it should be. In a military camp, the most common version of this was the pre-sleep prayer, addressed to one's patron saint, to the Virgin, to Christ directly, asking for protection through the night and guidance for the day to come. This was not considered magical in the pejorative sense. It was orthodox religious practice, and it was widespread. The man whose quiet, steady praying you were listening to earlier, before you finally slipped under, was doing something that his entire cultural framework endorsed as both spiritually appropriate and practically useful. He was not being naive. He was using the tools his world provided for managing a situation that lay beyond human control. Your dream about home has shifted now into something less comfortable. Dreams do this. They have their own internal narrative logic that does not always serve the dreamer's interests, and the sleeping mind is not always a kind storyteller. The familiar landscape of the home dream has acquired elements that do not belong there. There is something wrong with the light. Someone is missing who should be present, or present who should be absent. The comfortable geography has developed a quality of wrongness that you cannot identify precisely but that you recognize immediately, the way you recognize a smell associated with something bad before you remember what the association is. This is the anxiety dream, and it is doing what anxiety dreams do. It is providing a narrative container for feelings that have no other outlet, giving shape and story to the formless dread that has been running beneath the surface of this entire night. The medieval mind would not describe it in these terms, but the medieval mind would recognize the experience completely. Dreams of bad omen were familiar enough, and the response to waking from one was culturally scripted. prayer, the sign of the cross, an appeal to whatever protective spiritual force you had the closest relationship with. The bad dream was not just psychologically unpleasant. It was a potential signal, and the signal required a response. You wake from it with the particular abruptness of a dream that ended wrong. A sudden return to full consciousness, eyes open in the dark, heart doing something more emphatic than its usual business. For a moment, the complete disorientation of waking in an unfamiliar place in total darkness. Then the sounds of the camp locate you, the snoring, the horses, the distant sentry call, and you know where you are, and the dream recedes, and you are left with only its emotional residue. The feeling of wrongness without the narrative that produced it. The anxiety without the dream. You lie still and let it settle. This is the middle of the night, and the middle of the night is when every fear is largest and every comfort smallest, and the correct response, which medieval people knew as well as modern people, and managed with the tools they had, is to wait, to breathe, to let the dark do what the dark does, which is eventually become the pre-dawn gray, which eventually becomes the actual morning. The night is not permanent, even when it feels that way. This is one of those truths that is simple enough to state and hard enough to actually believe at 3 in the morning in a cold camp with a battle waiting. The stars have moved. You can see them through the gap between your cloak roof and the wagon side, a different configuration than the one you fell asleep under, the slow rotation of the night sky marking time in the way that medieval people, without mechanical clocks, used it to mark time. You are somewhere in the deepest part of the night, the long hours between the middle and the dawn when time moves strangely and the body is at its lowest ebb and everything feels simultaneously endless and fragile. A mainstream historical fact worth carrying here. Medieval people generally understood their sleep differently from the way modern people understand ours. The concept of 8 unbroken hours of sleep, the modern ideal enforced by artificial light schedules and work patterns, was not the medieval norm. The dominant pattern, for people who could follow their natural sleep rhythms, appears to have been biphasic, 2 distinct sleep periods separated by an hour or 2 of quiet wakefulness in the middle of the night. This waking interval was not considered a problem or an interruption. It was simply part of the night, a time for prayer, for quiet thought, for intimate conversation, for the small tasks that the day's busyness left no space for. The term used in some medieval sources, the first sleep and the second sleep, suggests this was understood as a natural structure rather than a disruption of sleep. In a military camp, this natural biphasic pattern mixed with the camp's own rhythms, the sentry rotations, the horse management, the various nocturnal disturbances, to create a night that was not cleanly divided into sleeping and waking but was a continuous negotiation between the two, with periods of deeper rest and periods of lighter consciousness flowing into each other without sharp boundaries. You have been living in this negotiation all night. The dream that just ended was part of it. The quiet, slightly expanded wakefulness you are in now, the prayer and reflection state in the medieval framework, is part of it too. You think in this quiet interval about the dream, about what it might mean in the framework your world provides for meaning. The home, the wrongness, the missing person, or the presence that should not have been there. Was it fear given narrative form? Was it your body processing the evening's cheese? Was it something else, a warning, a message, a communication from a source outside your own sleeping mind? You do not know. You cannot know. The medieval framework gives you a vocabulary for the question but not a certain answer to it. And the uncertainty, in its way, is the point. You are a small creature in a large and mostly opaque world, and the night and its dreams are one of the places where that opacity becomes most complete and most personal. You make the sign of the cross in the dark, quietly, more by instinct than decision. You say something brief and internal in the direction of whatever saint you have the closest relationship with. You ask for a better second sleep than the first. Then you close your eyes again, and let the sounds of the camp hold you, and wait for the morning that is coming whether you are ready for it or not. The horn sounds before the light does. It is not a gentle sound. It is not a gradual awakening, a soft progression from sleep to consciousness designed to ease the transition. It is a single, sustained, brass-throated blast that goes through the camp like a hand through water. Immediate, physical, impossible to sleep through, and it is followed almost instantly by a second, and then voices, and then the sound of the entire enormous organism of the army beginning to move at once. The change from the night's complicated stillness to this new noise is so abrupt and so total that for a moment your sleeping brain simply refuses to process it. It presents the sound as dream material, tries to incorporate it into whatever was happening in your second sleep, and fails. You are awake. You are completely awake. You are awake with the particular full-body alertness that only genuine alarm can produce, the kind that burns away every residue of sleep in a single second and leaves you sitting upright in the straw with your heart already running ahead of your thoughts. The sky above the wagon is gray. Not the deep charcoal gray of the middle night, but the specific, particular gray of the hour before sunrise. A gray with color in it, with the suggestion of light gathering at the horizon's edge, the night unwinding from the east with the slow inevitability that it always has and that always, at this moment, in this light, feels like something more than just physics. It is the gray that soldiers across all of history have watched coming and felt the same thing about, the end of the relative mercy of darkness, the arrival of the morning that has been waiting all night to deliver what it promised. You are on your feet before you are fully aware of having decided to stand. The body knows. The body has its own intelligence about moments like this, a biological protocol that bypasses the deliberating mind and goes directly to action. And right now the protocol says, stand, orient, assess. You stand. You orient. You assess. The camp around you is transforming with a speed that is genuinely remarkable. Minutes ago, or what feels like minutes, though the horn may have woken you from a deeper sleep than you thought. This was a field of horizontal shapes, still bodies, the complex stillness of a large group at rest. Now it is vertical. Men are rising from the ground, from under wagons, from within tents, from every surface and structure that provided anything approaching shelter, and they are rising with the practiced urgency of people who know exactly what this morning is and what it requires of them. There is noise, a great deal of noise, suddenly, after the night's more textured soundscape, but it is a purposeful noise, a noise with direction and intention, nothing like the random nocturnal din you have been navigating for hours. The horses are already being seen to. The horse handlers were up before the horn, or perhaps the horn was their signal specifically, because the horses require the most time and the most preparation, and the warhorse in particular, the destrier that the night depends on as both weapon and partner in what is coming, cannot be rushed through its morning routine without consequences. You can hear the horse lines from here, the stamp and blow of animals being moved, tacked up, fed their morning ration, prepared for the particular demands that today will make of them. Your own morning routine is considerably simpler and considerably faster, which is one of the few genuine advantages of your position in the hierarchy. You have no armor to don in the elaborate, time-consuming sequence that a night requires. You have no squire to manage the process, because you do not need one. You have your clothing, which you slept in, and your cloak, which you slept under, and your weapons, which have been within arm's reach all night because that was simply the correct thing to do and required no instruction. You are, in the most basic sense, already dressed for what is coming. You shake the straw from your cloak with a few brisk movements. You stamp your feet in your boots, which you did not remove, which means your feet have spent the night in that peculiar moist warmth that booted feet generate and which is now, in the morning cold, a less appealing environment than it was at midnight. The cold of the pre-dawn air hits your face and your hands with a clarity that is almost welcome after the complicated, body-warmed fug of the night's sleeping space. Your breath comes out in small clouds. The frost, if there is frost, is just visible on the grass beyond the wagon's shadow. Thin and white and already beginning to consider retreating as the sky lightens. The food situation for this morning is, if anything, more attenuated than last night's dinner. Campaign armies did not typically stop for a leisurely breakfast on the morning of a major engagement. There was neither the time nor the infrastructure for it, and eating heavily immediately before significant physical exertion was not considered advisable even within the limited nutritional understanding of the period. What you get is whatever you have. A piece of whatever bread remains from last night's distribution, perhaps gnawed standing up while you check your equipment. Some men have a flask of ale or watered wine, the morning version of the same caloric logic that made it the evening's drink of choice. Some have nothing at all, and are running entirely on the reserves of whatever the body stored from the previous days and whatever the biochemistry of extreme alertness produces in terms of available energy. The night's pavilion is a different story. as it always is. The Lord's morning, managed by his household staff with practiced efficiency, includes actual food, heated food in some cases, because the kitchen servants were awake before the horn preparing what they could. The knight himself is already in the process of being armed, his squire working through the sequence of pieces with the focused attention that the task demands. Arming a knight for battle was not a quick process. The full harness of a well-equipped late medieval knight, the plate armor that had reached its developmental peak by the 15th century, was a complex system of interlocking pieces that had to be donned in a specific order, fitted precisely to the individual's body, buckled and strapped and adjusted until everything sat correctly and moved as it should. A knight improperly armed was a knight at greater risk, and the squire who armed him bore a real responsibility for getting it right. You watch this process from a distance as you make your own preparations, not with resentment exactly, or not only with resentment, but with the particular complex attention that proximity to something you will never have tends to produce. The knight in his harness, when he is done, will be a different category of thing than you are. The armor is not just protection, it is transformation, the conversion of a man into something that reads as more than a man, a figure of metal and color and heraldic identity that operates on the imagination of everyone who sees it in ways that your wool and leather cannot. The psychological weight of plate armor in medieval warfare was not trivial. It made the man inside it feel differently about himself, and it made everyone outside it feel differently about him. A mainstream historical fact that sits interestingly in this morning context. The famous longbowmen of the English medieval armies, the weapon system that redefined European warfare across the 14th and 15th centuries, were at their most effective when they had had adequate rest and were physically fresh. The draw weight of a war bow, maintained by the English and Welsh archers who carried it, was extraordinary by any standard estimates based on archaeological examples and skeletal evidence from archers' remains suggest draws of 150 to 180 pounds, sustained across dozens of shots in the heat of battle. The skeletal remains of medieval archers are identifiable by the specific deformations that this sustained practice produced in their bones: enlarged left arms, asymmetrical shoulder development, spinal adaptations. This was a physical instrument that demanded physical investment, and the knight's rest, however inadequate, was part of that investment's maintenance. Around you, the unit is assembling itself with the informal efficiency of men who have done this before. There is a roll call of sorts, not a formal roster check with names and responses, but the instinctive accounting that a group of men who have been together for weeks performs automatically, the quick visual scan that establishes who is present and who is not. Someone is missing. A man who was here at the fire last night, whose spot in the sleeping arrangement was occupied all night, but who is not here now. This is noted. It is not commented on extensively. The conclusion is reached quickly and without drama, and then set aside, because there is nothing to be done about it and the morning has its own demands. Desertion, remember, as we noted in the long dark hours of Section 6. It happens. It happened last night in ones and twos and small groups, all across this camp. The army that rises this morning is slightly smaller than the army that went to sleep, and the difference is not from anything the enemy did. It is from the weight of the night and the weight of the morning, and the calculations that some men make in the dark that lead them away from the fire and into the countryside. You are still here. The light is growing faster now, the gray giving way to something with actual color in it, the first faint wash of gold at the horizon's edge, the sky above shading from gray to a blue that gets more blue by the minute. The stars are gone. Not dramatically, no final bright flash before extinction, but simply gone, absorbed back into the brightening sky the way all the night's specific qualities are being absorbed back into the general fact of day. The world is becoming visible, and visibility changes everything. You can see now what you could only hear and sense last night. The full extent of the camp, spreading across the field in both directions from where you stand, is revealed in the morning light as simultaneously larger and smaller than it felt in the dark. Larger because you can see it all at once. The full geography of it, the tent clusters and the wagon parks and the horse lines and the thousands of men now moving through it in purposeful currents. Smaller because daylight is always a reduction of the night's imagination. What felt vast and menacing in the dark resolves into something measurable, something with edges, something you can see the end of. And beyond the camp's edge, across the field, the enemy. This is the moment when the abstract fact of tomorrow, which was last night's most significant psychological burden, becomes the concrete fact of today. You can see them, or you can see what they are: another army, another camp, another collection of men going through their own version of the same morning, performing their own version of these same preparations, having spent their own version of this same night. The distance between the two camps is enough to make individual figures indistinguishable, but the overall shape of the enemy force is visible in the growing light, and it is, from this distance, genuinely impressive in a way that your stomach registers before your mind does. Historians still argue about the precise size of medieval armies and the reliability of the chronicle numbers that have come down to us. The figures given in contemporary accounts are frequently suspected of significant exaggeration, part of the literary tradition of making the stakes of a battle feel appropriately epic. The actual numbers, reconstructed from supply records and muster rolls and the physical evidence of battlefields, tend to be more modest than the chronicle claims. But even the revised numbers represent something that, when you are standing at one edge of it looking across at the other, is genuinely large. There are a lot of people over there. They have flags. They have trumpets, which are now also sounding, their sound carrying across the morning air with a clarity that the night's more diffuse soundscape could not have produced. The pre-battle ritual is beginning, and it is worth staying with for a moment because it is one of the distinctively medieval elements of this morning. The formal, ceremonial preparation for violence that the culture insisted upon before the violence itself could begin. Mass was said, where time and clergy permitted, the army's chaplains moving through their own urgent morning routines, conducting the shortest theologically permissible version of the liturgy for as many men as could be quickly gathered. The taking of communion before battle was not optional for men who understood the day's possible outcomes in spiritual terms, and the chaplains of a medieval army on the morning of an engagement were among its busiest members. Confession, if you had not managed it the previous night, was the other urgent sacramental business of the morning. The line for the chaplain's attention was not orderly, in the way that lines in a military camp the morning of a battle are not orderly, but it existed, and men moved through it with the focused efficiency of people who had a specific spiritual transaction to complete and were not going to let the morning's time pressure prevent them from completing it. You have already made your peace with this, or as much peace as the previous night's circumstances allowed. The sign of the cross in the dark after the bad dream. The quiet words directed at your patron saint. It is not the full formal sacramental preparation, but it is what the night provided, and it will have to be enough. The quirky historical detail that belongs here is one of the more humanizing footnotes in the entire record of medieval warfare, the practice of soldiers exchanging small personal objects before battle. Rings, tokens, the kind of thing that could be returned to a family if the worst happened, and that served as identification as much as keepsake. The medieval equivalent of the dog tag, improvised from whatever small personal property was meaningful and portable. A ring from a wife or mother, a small medallion of a patron saint, a piece of fabric from a specific garment. These objects passed between men in the early morning with a matter-of-factness that was not quite the same as despair. It was practical, it was loving, it was the acknowledgement of a possibility without surrendering to it. You have something. You have had it in your pack or on your person for the entire campaign, and you take it out now and hold it for a moment in the morning light, just a moment, just the weight of it in your hand, just the specific texture of it against your fingers, before putting it back where it belongs. This is a private act. No one is watching. No one needs to know what it is or what it means, because what it means is between you and the person who gave it to you, who is somewhere not here, in a place that last night's dream visited and this morning's reality cannot reach. The formations are beginning to take shape. The captains and sergeants and whatever other organizational figures exist in this particular army structure are moving through the camp with increasing urgency, directing men to their positions, creating order out of the morning's productive chaos. You find your place, you know your place, this has been rehearsed in the weeks of marching. The position you occupy in the line is as familiar as any part of the campaign's geography, and you take it. The men around you are the men you know, the men who were beside you in the night, the faces that have become as familiar as the landscape over weeks of shared misery and occasional shared laughter. To your left, the man who slept through everything, the extraordinary sleeper, the champion of unconsciousness who went under sometime after the second hour of the night and did not surface until the horn, is adjusting his equipment with the slightly dazed efficiency of someone who genuinely rested and is now paying attention to the morning. You feel, toward him, something that is not quite envy anymore. Something more like affection, actually. He slept. He managed it. In the circumstances, this is an achievement worth respecting. To your right, the man who was praying last night, the one whose quiet, steady voice was the thread you followed into your second sleep, is quiet now. Not the quiet of someone who has run out of words, but the quieter quiet of someone who finished what they needed to say and is now standing in the space that prayer creates when it is done. He meets your eye briefly. Something passes between you that requires no language and uses none. The sun is at the horizon now, fully committed to its appearance, flooding the field with the low golden light of an early morning that is, objectively, beautiful. The dew on the grass catches it. The metal of the assembled army catches it and throws it back in 1,000 directions, so that the entire field seems to glitter with the morning, seems to be full of light, seems to be something other than what it is. It is, if you let yourself see it for just a moment without the context, genuinely magnificent. You let yourself see it for just a moment. Then the drums begin. And now, let's stay here, right here, in the moment just before the drums change everything, and let the morning breathe for a little while. You made it through the night. That straw, that cloak, that root in your knee, that rat in your bread, the lice and the cold and the bad dream and the praying man and the extraordinary sleeper and the hoarse lines and the sentries calling in the dark and the distant fires that may or may not have been fires. You carried all of it through the long hours from dusk to this dawn. And you are still standing, and the morning light is on your face. Somewhere in the centuries between that morning and this one, everything changed. The armies and their camps and their hierarchies of sleep. The rats are still with us, and the anxiety before difficult days, and the dreams that take us home when our bodies are far from it. The fires we gather around are different now, and the horns have different names, and the man in the tent with the better sleeping arrangements remains, stubbornly, the man in the tent with the better sleeping arrangements. But the night itself, the long, cold, noisy, uncomfortable, surprisingly human night, that has not changed so much. The body that needed rest and could not quite find it. The mind that went to the same places minds have always gone when the dark gives it nowhere else to be. The small private rituals before sleep. The bad dream and the sign of the cross after it. The morning arriving anyway, indifferent to your readiness, golden and cold and absolute. You stood in that field. You spent that night. You know what it was now in the way that only the slow unfolding of a long dark story can teach you. Not the facts of it, but the texture, the weight, the smell of wood smoke and damp wool and hoarse and cold earth. That was what it felt like to be a small human in a very large history. The drums are still. The morning holds. Let it hold you a little longer. Let the golden light stay on your face. Let the sounds of the camp soften around you. The horses quieting, the voices dropping, the whole vast organism of the army settling into the deep breath before what comes next. You are tired. Of course you are tired. You barely slept, and what sleep you managed was complicated and strange and interrupted by rats and lice and bad dreams and the sound of 10,000 strangers breathing in the dark. But you are here. You are standing in the morning light with the dew on the grass and the sun in your eyes. And that, across all the centuries and all the cold nights between that world and this one, is something. The night is over. Rest now.